We were generously welcomed to country this morning by Wadawurrung Elder Joy Alderker, and we express our respect for elders past and present and extend this respect to First Nations people who are part of this event. It's an absolute delight for us to welcome today Professor Duncan Iveson to deliver this year's lecture, which is titled Democracy Regained, Uluru and Australian Citizenship. We've all been looking forward to this. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Duncan in his role on council, where he's generously served since 2019. He was elected as a Fellow of the Academy in 2009. Duncan is Professor of Political Philosophy at the University of Sydney. He has contributed significantly to our body of knowledge on the topics of political philosophy, the history of political thought, and moral philosophy. In addition to working hard for the Academy, Duncan has collaborated extensively with government, community and industry partners. Many of you will know him in his role as DVC Research at Sydney Uni, and before that, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and Head of the School of Humanities. Among many other roles, he's been Chair of the Group of 8 Deputy Vice-Chancellors Research Committee, a member of the ARC Council and a board member of the United States Studies Centre and the James Martin Institute of Public Policy. So you can understand why we value his strategic advice on all manner of things. According to Duncan's LinkedIn profile, quote, he has a passion for engaging diverse audiences about the philosophical dimensions of many of the greatest challenges facing us today, unquote, which I believe is what he'll do during this Academy lecture. Please join me in welcoming Duncan Iveson.
Thanks, Leslie. Having your LinkedIn page read, that's a new low for me, I think. So let me also begin by paying my respects to the Wadawurrung and the Djadjawurrung here on this beautiful country, and it's an absolute privilege to be here. And I've always wanted to say this, let me first thank the Academy for this invitation. It's been a great first day, and I hope that in this final session today, some of the threads we've begun to weave will start to come together a bit. And for those of you who are just joining us now for the first time, hopefully you'll get a sense of some of the issues we've been talking about. So we live in an age of anxiety about the death of democracy. And, perhaps it's always been thus. Worries about the fragility and health of democracy are as old as democracy itself. A flood of recent books captures this mood. Levitsky and Ziblatt's How Democracies Die, David Runciman's How Democracy Ends, Douglas Schoen's The End of Democracy, Anne Applebaum's The Twilight of Democracy, John Keene's The Life and Death of Democracy, quickly followed by The New Despotism, and Pippa Norris's brilliant cultural backlash. And alongside these obituaries for democracy are autopsies of its accompanying political theory. Patrick Deneen's How Liberalism Failed, Pankaj Mishra's The Age of Anger, Francis Fukuyama's Liberalism and Its Discontents, Niall Ferguson and Fareed Zakaria's The End of the Liberal Order. You get the picture. So why do so many political scientists and political theorists fear for the current state of liberal democracy? The rise of Trump and Putin and Modi and Orban and Xi and other soft and hard autocrats, along with Brexit, the January 6th assault on the Capitol, the Ukrainian war, and other events, has shaken the complacent assumptions, perhaps, about the onward march of democracy in the 21st century. Levitsky and Ziblatt's argument in How Democracies Die, I think, is instructive in this regard. Today, democracies don't die at the hands of men with guns. They, as they tended to do, say, in the middle of the 20th century, they die at the hands of elected leaders. And more often than not, they erode slowly as the institutions and norms that underpin democratic practices are hollowed out. Blatant dictatorships, for the most part, have disappeared. Democracies die through the ballot box. Maybe all the dictators are calling you at the moment. To counteract these tendencies, Levitsky and Ziblatt argue that democratic systems need to find a way of isolating extremist demagogues and ensuring that democratic institutions and norms constrain them if they do get elected. And the role of democratic norms is crucial, and especially the mutual toleration of rivals and forbearance, that you exercise restraint in deploying all the institutional prerogatives at your disposal. Now, arguably, the United States has failed the first test and is dangerously close to failing the second, although this week, I think, has me feeling a bit more hopeful. So it might seem perverse, then, that my central claim in the lecture this afternoon is that we should see the Uluru Statement from the Heart and its call for a voice to Parliament as essentially a democratic claim. That's really the only thing you have to leave with from me this afternoon, that we should see it as a democratic claim. And I think this is the most productive way of thinking through the challenge it presents. It's not best understood, I think, as an expression of identity politics. It's not woke. And nor does it require us to resile from our liberal democratic values. We should see it in the context of what I'm going to call democratic liberalism. Now, lying behind my claim is a vision of how democracies live rather than die. Of course, our situation is not like the United States or Hungary, and I don't want to raise the stakes any further than they already are for the forthcoming referendum. But I hope to persuade you that our collective engagement with the proposal for a voice to Parliament represents a potential moment of constitutional and political transformation for Australia. Paul Keating used to say that when you change the government, you change the country. It's even more true when you change the Constitution. But it's also not only about changing the Constitution. It's also about how we think about the nature of citizenship and the norms of our democratic life. So if democracies die when democratic norms and institutions come apart, it comes alive when we weave together new modes of collective action and institutional innovation. Now, I won't spend too much time setting out what the Uluru Statement from the Heart says, as I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with it by now. But let me summarize some of the key elements for the purposes of my lecture. First, it's important to note how the statement emerged. It's one of a long series of attempts by Australia's First Peoples to demand recognition from and engagement with the Australian state and its people, going back to the time of invasion and settlement. However, the current proposal emerged out of a series of attempts over the last decade at least at recognizing Aboriginal peoples in the Australian Constitution. And Noel Pearson has outlined some of that history in his recent Boyer lectures, as has Megan Davis in a series of really excellent papers, in addition to everything else that Megan does. But the aspect I want to highlight here is how the Uluru Statement from the Heart arose over 2016 and 2017 from a series of innovative First Nation regional dialogues across the country in the lead up to the First Nations Constitutional Convention at Uluru in May 2017. It was from these Indigenous-led and designed dialogues that the proposal for the voice came about in the form that we have it today. And as you know, there's two main recommendations that are important for my purposes this afternoon. First, for the establishment of a representative body of First Nations people, guaranteed in the Constitution, to advise government on policy affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And secondly, the establishment of a Makarrata Commission to inaugurate a treaty-making process, as well as a mechanism for creating public space for truth-telling about our history. Now, this was followed in 2021 by an extensive and again Indigenous-led co-design and consultation process aimed at developing principles and frameworks for establishing local and regional voices as well as a national voice. And that final report, delivered by Marcia Langton and Tom Kalma in July of 2021, proposed that representatives at both the local and national level should be selected by their communities in a way that reflects local norms and cultural authority. It also emphasized that local deliberative processes must develop mechanisms to ensure that the vulnerable and unheard voices also have an equal opportunity to participate. Finally, that report also set out how the national voice could operate, including standards for when, how, and on what matters Parliament should consult with the voice and the voice with government. Thus, the voice, and this is the point I want to start off with, is itself already a product of a deeply deliberative process of what the Cree and Gnawa legal scholar Val Napoleon calls Indigenous intense democracy. And it's clear when you read the summaries of the regional dialogues and debates that the strong preference of participants was indeed for the creation of a constitutionally guaranteed deliberative body capable of speaking directly to government, rather than, with apologies to my legal colleagues in the room, relying on entrenched legal rights, which, as we've learned, depend on governments and courts to interpret and be enforced. Now, I'm not saying that the voice is valuable because it meets some pre-established standard of Western democracy. We'll explore how to make sense of democracy in a moment. One thing the voice will enable, I believe, is an opportunity for the First Nations of Australia, across Australia, to make sense of democratic practices in their own terms. The final report on the co-design process makes clear just how diverse Indigenous decision-making forums are likely to be. So when I say that we should see the proposal for a voice to Parliament in democratic terms, I'm not suggesting we just kind of fold it into our existing democratic theories. The challenge is deeper and much more interesting than that. So let me try and explain. So first, we need to challenge the standard assumption that the Australian state and its boundaries are justified, and hence that somehow the justificatory burden is on Indigenous peoples as to why they have the rights and powers that they claim to possess. That assumption lies at the foundation of much contemporary legal and political theory today. So instead, we have to flip that. And we must ask, on what grounds is the liberal state's sovereignty and control over territory justified to Indigenous peoples? And I think if we fail to grapple with that fundamental question, then many of the critical issues to do with sovereignty, property, or the scope of rights, and indeed even quite, policy-ish matters, becomes problematically predetermined. The second thing we have to grapple with, and we've started to do that, I think, today, is the legacy of settler colonialism. As that great La Trobe sociologist and historian Patrick Wolf put it, settler colonies were premised on the elimination of native societies. The seizure and control of territory is thus at the heart of settler colonialism. And the colonial justification of dispossession drew on ideologies of civilizational and racial superiority and the denigration of Indigenous peoples' philosophies and cultural practices and ways of life. And recent scholarship has shown that many of the arguments justifying the expropriation of property and territory and the incorporation of Indigenous societies into the settler state came from canonical figures in liberal political thought. The history of many of our core concepts in liberalism, including sovereignty, property, human rights, self-determination, and indeed democracy, is inextricably linked with the justification of colonialism and empire. However, that history is complex. There are deep currents of anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist thought in the liberal tradition as well. Moreover, there has always been resistance by indigenous peoples to settler colonialism. This is clear from the extensive frontier violence and wars that occurred in Australia, Canada, the United States, and New Zealand from settlement onwards. It's also clear from the hundreds of treaties signed between First Nations, European, and North American powers between at least 1600 and 1800. Indigenous peoples fought back and argued back. In so doing, they helped shape the emerging global law of nations, as well as the very constitutional orders of Anglo-American and New Zealand settler states. But the other crucial aspect of the challenge is this: the dispossession of indigenous peoples' lands and political institutions is not something that's only happened in the past. It's ongoing. After all, it was only in 1992 that we recognized native title in Australia. And it was only in 2019 that the High Court recognized that compensation might be due for cultural loss because of dispossession. So remembering this, I think, helps put claims about the voice somehow inserting race-based politics into our Constitution in proper perspective, and this came up nicely this morning. For it was successive Australian governments in the 19th and 20th centuries who approached Indigenous issues through the language and lens of race and used it to discriminate against First Nations people. The current Australian Constitution is suffused with the history of racial politics. I think remembering this also focuses attention on the extent to which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are cultural and political entities, not racial ones. The proposal makes clear that the voice will interact with parliamentary sovereignty, not stand aside from it. In the era of hyper-political polarization, we need more of these cross-cultural forums for civic conversation, not less. So, dispossession of territory and political domination are the two key moral wrongs of settler colonialism that a liberal democratic state and liberal democratic thought and practice has to deal with. To put it bluntly, the constitutional and political order of Australia remains essentially unsettled. However, the proposal for a voice to Parliament, and I think crucially the sort of process it has inaugurated, offers an opportunity for us to address these uncomfortable issues. For it's clear that in offering the proposal for a voice, and a deliberative voice, First Nation communities have opted against either an appeal to rights within the existing legal and constitutional system, or at least only to that, or a declaration of formal sovereignty independent of the Australian state, again, as we explored this morning. At the same time, the voice is clearly rooted in a claim of ancient spiritual sovereignty, as the statement puts it, that can shine through as a fuller expression of Australian nationhood. How can it do so? So I've framed the voice so far as a democratic project, rather than a legal or technical one, nor is it an expression of identity politics. The challenge to our existing democratic institutions, as I outlined above, is that if we reject the grounds upon which Indigenous peoples were originally excluded from Australia's founding, then we have serious unfinished business to attend to. If the challenges to our existing democratic institutions are so significant, then what kind of democracy is the voice gesturing towards? And what does it demand of us as citizens? So let me just for a moment take a step back and explain some of the underlying values at stake. And I know when a philosopher says that, people's hearts sink, because I think it's going to get really boring, but just bear with me for a minute. What do I mean by democratic liberalism? So democracy is a system under which individuals share equally in the control of the people over government. There'll be a quiz afterwards where you have to respond appropriately. Of course, even this basic sense then can be sort of extended in time and space. For my purposes, democracy is closely related to both protecting people from domination by those who exercise power over them, and then also enabling people to live together in ways that treat each other as free and equal. This is the liberal dimension of democratic liberalism. And let me just say a bit more about this. So liberalism is a complex tradition, but central to its modern variants today, at least, is the ongoing attempt to sort of balance these competing demands of liberty and equality. And in the latter half of the 20th century, the emergence of egalitarian liberalism, epitomized in the work of people like, John Rawls, Habermas, Martha Nussbaum, Elizabeth Anderson, put this reconciliation of liberty and equality at the heart of the modern tradition. And a critical aspect of this is the combination of the protection of, on the one hand, the private sort of autonomy of individuals, including the relationships they form, with the public autonomy of citizens. This dual relationship between liberty and democratic equality is at the core of contemporary liberalism. You can't have one without the other, but it generates then a series of profound philosophical, political challenges. So democratic liberalism, at least as I understand it, offers at least two things. First, equal dignity to its citizens and to the groups they form, insofar as they're able to express their views, make claims, seek justifications for the exercise of power over them. They're entitled to protections for those freedoms required to form and express their views in the first place, as well as form relationships with others without fear of interference or domination from the state and other powerful actors. The other thing it's meant to do is deliver those resources required to live a decent life, including those public goods that come through stability and prosperity over time. But it's also an ethical vision. It's a way of being in the world. Now, one of the great challenges of our time has been to understand how deep structural forms of inequality, including those linked to legacy of historical injustice, get in the way of the realization of these values. And political activism has been a key element of this struggle. The great civil rights movements of the 1960s and 70s, both here and in the United States, although, in this case appealing to a vision of equal civil rights for all, also argued strongly for targeted measures to address deeply entrenched social and economic inequality. Martin Luther King's famous 1963 book, Why We Can't Wait, is a great example of that duality, of appealing beautifully to our common humanity, while at the same time, something Erica Betts never acknowledged, arguing for direct measures such as reparations and affirmative action to tackle structural racism in American society. And indeed, the recognition of collective and group rights has also been part of that emerging democratic debate as a precondition for realizing the value of democratic equality. Now, one thing structural injustice does is erode the basis for trustful relations between citizens. And once again, I'm just going to slow things down for a minute, so bear with me. It's sort of the evil twin of democratic citizenship, structural inequality. It gets in the way of us forming trustful social and political relations. And I think There's four key elements to liberal democratic trust, which, when present, are characteristic of social and political relationships that are trustful, and that in turn help promote the trustworthiness of liberal democratic institutions. And I just want to unpack them, because this is just to give you a bit more of a sense of what I mean when I think we should see the proposal for a voice as essentially a democratic claim. It's in part creating the infrastructure for reconstituting trust in Australia today. So the first of these four elements, as hopefully should now be clear, is that social and political relationships in liberal democratic societies ought to be distinctly democratic. That is, that they involve the collective exercise of power over and with others in ways that are not only legitimate, but fair. The promise is not merely that citizens have a say about the power that is exercised over them, but they have a share in it in some meaningful sense. This element is probably one of the most challenging for democratic liberals to redeem. The danger is always that liberal institutions remain overly elitist and proceduralist, leaving too many forms of domination intact and unchallenged. And for that reason, we can't just rely on individual virtue alone. So the first element of establishing trustful social and political relations is that they be genuinely democratic in nature. The second element of liberal democratic trust is the related idea of what I'll call democratic contestation, democratic public reasoning. And this is where it gets a bit abstract, so you can tune out now if you want, but not for long. Citizens ought to be committed to engaging in practical deliberation with each other and also possess the means to do so. As the political philosopher Anthony Leyden has put it, practices of deliberation focus on reasons which act as claims and considerations we urge on one another in the course of forming, altering, maintaining our relationships. And so reasons acquire authority under this ideal, I think, when they find support in those relationships and form part of our practical identities. And they do that because of our adapting them as reasons we recognize as our own. They're not kind of foreign impositions from outside. And so trustful relations develop best when citizens are reasonable in this sense, not in some otherworldly sense, but in that very practical sense. That is, when our common deliberations not only produce good outcomes, but also manifest a commitment to respecting the relationships that obtain between us. And so reasoning then is not only about getting what we want, it's also about claims we make on each other in view of the relationships we're creating. Now, of course, this is an ideal rather than the reality of everyday democratic practice. It's not being practiced up on Skye late with Rowan and his friends. Non-deliberative modes of communications can help shift public debate and attack concentrated power alongside more deliberative ones. And deliberative democracy, even as an ideal, doesn't provide an escape from all kinds of relations of power. They persist stubbornly, even as we try to eradicate them. And of course, government responsiveness is stratified by socioeconomic status and race, as sociologists and political scientists teach us. And we get our reasoning wrong. Often, our cognitive architecture, if you put it that way, blinds us in ways that are often unintentionally and sometimes intentionally self-serving. So there are limits to deliberative politics. It must also be accompanied by institutional arrangements that provide genuine material counterpowers to manipulation and coercion by the powerful. But institutional constraints alone are insufficient, as we'll see in a moment. trustworthy relations to be sustainable require both successful modes of collective reasoning together in that way I tried to sketch, including what I might call insurgent, practical politics, civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter, indigenous movements, as well as strong institutional constraints. So, 4 elements in trustful social political relationships. They must be distinctly democratic. We must sort of commit ourselves to a certain form of practical reasoning, however hard it is to realize in reality. And there's a 3rd element, which I think is equally important. And this is what I'll call the capacity for political empathy. And I think it touches on the last session quite interestingly. And empathy for me refers to the capacity of human beings, in this context at least attempt to apprehend the emotions and perspectives of others, if only imperfectly. And of course, this raises all kinds of challenges. But for my purposes, I just mean it's the capacity of citizens to be at least able to imagine what it would be like to be in another's shoes, to be, as it were, an intelligent reader of another's story, or perhaps an intelligent interpreter of another's image. It's to be attentive to the tone, the details, and perspective of their story, and crucially, the person telling it. So, for example, for some philosophers, this is so important, it should indeed be the object of a theory of justice. It's something we have a right, as it were, to the capacities to develop. I don't want to defend that here, but I think it gives you a sense of the importance. And why is it so important? Well, think about what it is to trust. To trust is to leave yourself open to betrayal. To be trustworthy is to be therefore alert to that vulnerability of the other. Democratic trust begins to break down when claims of injustice are misunderstood because of the lack of attentiveness to the narratives in which they're embedded, thus often entrenching the misrecognition and maldistribution that generated those claims in the first place. And this inattentiveness is a crucial feature of liberal democratic failure, I think, in communities with legacies of historical injustice. And of course, it's social movements who are often reminding us of our inattentiveness. So I think this 3rd element is a really crucial one. So thankfully, this leads us to the 4th and final element of our account of liberal democratic trust. Trustful exercises of power are more likely to develop and be sustained when there's a high degree of tolerance for and resilience in the face of the regular contestation of the norms and outcomes of the democratic process. This might seem a bit paradoxical for those of you who are paying attention. Trust is actually reinforced when there's a suitable degree of distrust in the system. In many ways, the ability of citizens to test the trustworthiness of each other and the institutions within which they act is critical for the sustainability of trust over the long term. It's particularly important in contexts where trust is perceived to have been repeatedly broken. And again, it's often the role of social movements to do this. There's my book of 2022 is by a wonderful political theorist named Diva Woodley. It's a kind of phenomenological account of the Black Lives Matter movement. And she borrows an analogy of swaling, which is essentially controlled burning. And she says what social movements do is induce a kind of controlled burning in the democratic environment to create the conditions for new growth and new sort of relationships to be kind of reborn. I think there's something to that idea. Trustful relations, in other words, are resilient in the face of insurgent tests of distrust. And so there's a weird kind of paradoxical aspect to that, but I think it's very powerful. Of course, That trust and distrust dynamic can turn sour as well. Periodic insurgent distrust, both epistemic, subjective, intersubjective, can deepen to the point where the possibility for sustaining some of those other elements, like common practical reasoning, are undermined. And this in turn can undermine some of the key elements of other aspects of trustful relations. We become less democratic, less reasonable, less empathetic, and increasingly fragmented. And then this constitutes another kind of democratic failure, in addition to the more familiar ones that we learn from people like Tocqueville and others that tend to emerge in democratic cultures. So, to bring this together now, I think we should consider the claims at the heart of the Uluru Statement in the context of this rich and evolving tradition of democratic liberalism and the attempt to establish just and trustful relations between citizens, as hard as that is. The Voice is not demanding a repudiation somehow of liberal democratic values, but is rather a kind of insurgent expression of them. However, one deeply informed by a genuine reckoning with our colonial past and present, one that is taking seriously those two challenges I just articulated a couple of moments ago. It's not a simple assertion of identity claims. It's not a simple assertion of separatism. Rather, it's a call for democratic innovation in how we address our past and also our future. It's a call for engagement and the ongoing reconciliation, if I can use that word, not in the way it usually is used, of the democratic freedom of Australia's Indigenous peoples with the equality claimed by all. But as I said earlier, the challenge is not simply inserting Indigenous peoples into our pre-existing conception of Australian democracy, but rather grappling with the consequences of our history. So how do we think that through? Well, first, the conception of democracy I think it prefigures is more open, pluralistic, and dialogic than many of those dominant in the political science discourse today. Recall the earlier anxieties about the death of democracy. Democracy dies, according to these accounts, when institutions break down and elites fail to prevent demagogues from gaining influence, and when we fail to vote the bastards out. Democratic norms break down as our community becomes more polarized. But this tends to limit democratic practice, including democratic citizenship, to voting and to institutional behavior. These are very important elements of democratic legitimacy, but too narrow, I think, for our purposes. Moreover, they tend to presuppose some of the crucial boundary conditions of democracy have been solved, namely, who is in and out of the demos, and on what grounds, and what the relevant decision-making fora are. And as we saw, these questions remain open for a society grappling with the legacy of settler colonialism. That is one of the aspects of the disordered nature of our constitutional order. So one way of understanding the voice is as a move to democratize the process of democratization in Australia. Again, that sounds paradoxical, but it isn't. It prefigures what I think of as a disclosive and ethical dimension to democratic practice. As we work collectively in conditions of deep pluralism to figure out the terms on which we can live together, new perspectives, understandings, and practices are disclosed to us. We then must come up with new ways of addressing those perspectives and practices and the consequences they reveal in ways that are consistent with treating people as free and equal. Constitutionally recognizing a voice to Parliament creates a structured conversation about not just the legacy of settler colonialism, but also the future. the challenge evolves as we are now aware of a plurality of normative orders that exist, as revealed through indigenous democratic practices, which were previously invisible not only to us, but to our legal and political institutions. And then it's through those practices that indigenous citizens and others make sense of not only the power being exercised over them, but the best way of securing their equal freedom, as well as that of others. But let's be clear, in being disclosed, that doesn't necessarily make the democratic conversation any easier. Disagreements persist, new misunderstandings emerge, our aspirations sit alongside our prejudices in all kinds of ways. But democracy, understood in this way, works recursively, oriented by the demand that individuals and groups share equally in this collective work of ruling. I think it's what Noel Pearson was gesturing at in his 1994 Academy of Humanities Hancock lecture, when he claimed that Mabo was, quote, the citizenship decision for Indigenous Australians, the, quote, beginning of the sharing of justice and citizenship in this country. Now, one tantalizing possibility that emerges from taking Indigenous democratic systems on their own terms, in the way I've been suggesting, is for the ongoing democratization of not only our democratic practices, but the very life systems within which we live. Without overgeneralizing, Indigenous democratic practices, at least as I understand them, coming from where I live in Australia, often take a more densely relational, multi-species perspective on the relevant boundaries of the demos. It's not only humans who are responsible to each other, who can make claims, and who owe each other justifications, but also that plants, animals, lands, and rivers also are party to the conversation. As the Anishinaabe legal philosopher John Burroughs put it, quote, the earth is an archive that we must learn to read, scientifically, socially, culturally, legally, spiritually, and politically. Democracies must look backward to life's sources to narrate any political momentum forward. So this approach, I think, also prefigures a conception of citizenship. Who is a citizen, who isn't, is a critical boundary condition for democratic theory. But in this more dialogic, pluralistic, recursive conception of democracy that I'm trying to sketch, our conception of citizenship also changes. Liberal citizenship, again, as we've learned today, is usually understood as a universalizable legal and political status, grounded in certain basic rights and duties, both positive and negative, institutional and moral. A citizen is entitled to basic rights and freedoms which enable them to participate equally in the rule of the people, including at a minimum those rights of freedom of speech, movement, association, to vote, in order to participate equally. In turn, she has duties to obey the law when appropriately legitimate and engage sufficiently in political life to ensure the robustness of our democratic institutions. On the account I'm trying to sketch here, citizenship is less a status than it is a practice. Now, these two aren't mutually exclusive, but the emphasis shifts. In short, one becomes a citizen by acting like one. As John Dewey, the great early 20th century American political theorist of democracy, claimed, and more recently, the Canadian political philosopher James Tully has put it, citizenship is not a status given by the institutions of the state or international law, but a negotiated practice in which one becomes a citizen through participation. And one way of cashing that out is a difference between what we might call civic citizenship and civil citizenship. Civil citizenship presupposes a set of legal and political institutions which kind of define the office of citizenship. Civic citizenship, on the other hand, presupposes practices of citizenship, and thus a dense network of relations of acting in concert with others. Now, these are not mutually exclusive, as Dewey and others emphasize. Healthy representative civil democracies are grounded in healthy civic practices of citizenship, those everyday relational practices of listening, participating, negotiating, and compromise, which in turn, of course, are protected and nurtured through appropriate institutional safeguards as well. Democracy is not just a set of institutions, in other words, but a social idea. Okay, let me now conclude. I've argued for the proposal for a voice to Parliament should be seen not as a claim for special rights or as an outburst of identity politics. Rather, it's a democratic claim drawing on the deep resources of Western and Indigenous democratic practices, but also challenging them. I've interpreted the voice in the context of what I've called democratic liberalism and suggested that it offers a profound challenge to our current understanding of democracy and citizenship. Citizenship on this reading should be grasped first as a practice, though working out, under conditions of pluralism, of our ways of living together equally. And in this context, that means reconciling the ancient sovereignty of Aboriginal Australia with the ongoing legitimation of the Australian state. And this yields, I think, a final tantalizing opportunity being missed in the current debate. It's often said that you can't undo the past, and especially when it comes to the founding of a country. But the democratic vision embedded in the voice, at least as I've tried to understand it, provides an opportunity for the ongoing reinterpretation of our country's identity and future. Noel Pearson has talked about the three great pillars of Australia's modern identity: ancient Aboriginal Australia, the legacy of British common law, and the deep multiculturalism of contemporary Australia. I think there's a fourth, or at least a variation on the second, which is Australia's democratic institutions and the ability to innovate democratically given the challenges we face. The upcoming referendum offers us the chance to draw deeply on that pillar and forge a new future for our country. Thank you.